There's an important question that a lot of chess players have struggled with over the years, and that is, what is the best defense against 1e4? This move, after all, is the most popular choice for white, and it's also a very aggressive continuation, so it pays to know what exactly to do against it. But in a sea of possibilities and different defenses available to us, it can be really difficult to decide which one is best for you. In order to help you solve this problem, what we are going to do in this video is we're going to rank the different openings according to what I consider, at least, to be from most difficult, that would make them only suited to more advanced players, to least difficult, and those of course would be the best ones if you are a beginner or intermediate level player. We're going to be working our way through all of the major responses against e4, so we have a lot of material to cover. So let's dive right in, starting with the toughest opening to play against e4 in my opinion. This move marks the beginning of the modern defense, and that is, in my view, as difficult of an opening as it gets. Well, why is this? For starters, after d4, white is allowed to immediately build up a big pawn center. I think you should avoid this if you're a beginner or early intermediate player, because it makes playing the middle games much harder because you have less space for your pieces. Now, in addition to this, after black continues their development, black often is required to make some strange looking pawn moves, such as first pawn to d6 and then pawn to a6. So 3 out of black's first 4 moves have been pawn moves. Now, white's play, on the other hand, is relatively simple. White has grabbed the center and is developing the pieces very well. And you can see that the play continues to be strange from black, where black plays this move, pawn to b5, ignoring for the time being their king in the center. So this kind of a setup, definitely not one for beginners. Let's take a look at the next opening, which is a little bit of a sister opening of the modern defense, but in my view, less difficult to play. Here we are after the first move d6, marking the beginning of the so-called Pirc Defense. Now, the Pirc Defense is kind of similar. We can see after d4, knight f6, knight c3, and g6, we can see that white has built up the center, and black is also playing this d6 and g6 pawn formation. One of the things that differentiates the Pirc, however, is that the knight has already developed to f6. So when you're developing the king's knight and you're about to develop the bishop, you do have the possibility of castling kingside, whereas we saw in the modern that your king is still stuck in the center for a long time. So this at least makes it somewhat more beginner friendly, but nevertheless, I wouldn't recommend allowing your opponent to build up this pawn center. And speaking of the pawn center, I think one of the things that makes the Pirc difficult to play is that white has the possibility of f4. This is the so-called Austrian attack, and white can, if you're not careful, try and steamroll you in the center with e5. Now, there's one more thing I want to say about the Pirc that can make things kind of difficult to play, and that is that after bishop to g7, knight f3, castle, and bishop to d3, in this position, black's way of continuing development requires a deep strategic understanding. For example, black normally goes knight a6, and here white has the possibility of capturing, when you need to know whether accepting this bad pawn structure with 2 pawns doubled and isolated on the a file is worth it for black, because after all, in exchange, they are left with the bishop pair. But these are difficult factors to consider, and even if white doesn't capture you, which normally they don't, and they play castle, in this position you have to be ready to play a move like pawn to c5, once again entertaining this possibility. And after white plays d5, that's the main move, now you need to be ready to play against a white central pawn majority that is dominating on the light squares. So we saw, if we go back a few moves here, we saw that we spoke about the possibility of white advancing on the dark squares, and then you also have to worry about white's setup on the light squares. So you need to be really versatile in your understanding of different pawn structures, different piece exchanges, and of course coping with having less space in the center of the board. That makes the Pirc a little bit less intimidating than the modern, but certainly not beginner friendly at all. Let's check out the next opening. In my view, there's 2 openings that come next in terms of difficulty, and they're the Alekhine Defense and the Scandinavian Defense. So the Alekhine Defense starts with the move knight to f6, And what I think makes this opening challenging is that white is allowed to play e5, black now has to spend 2 moves with the knight, and then after d4, black needs to challenge this space advantage that white has obtained in the center. And after a series of moves like knight f3, bishop g4, bishop e2, e6, we're just having normal moves, but what happens here is that white typically will play c4, targeting this knight, forcing it back, and so you end up with a middle game, something along these lines. You have to capture with the pawn, and the reason for this is if you capture with the bishop, then c5 happens, so capture with the pawn, and you wind up with a middle game position like this a lot of the time. Now, the problem that I see is that in the Alekhine, black has moved this knight around from f6 to d5 to b6. It's not even that well placed on b6 because all it does is hit this pawn, but white can play b3 at some given moment, and then the knight is kind of misplaced. And sometimes as well, white can even target that knight with a4, a5. So black has to concern themselves with, some problem piece there on the queen side. And importantly, black has less space than white. Black has these 2 pawns here, whereas white's pawns on d4 and c4 are a lot more healthy. So the reason why I think that the Alekhine is kind of not such a good choice for beginners is because while the play is actually not so difficult to understand as in the modern or even in the Pirc, you do give up a pretty big advantage. And I just don't think that's a good idea when you're earlier into your chess development. As you become more advanced, I think that the Alekhine is actually a great choice at the intermediate and late intermediate level. And the reason for this is because in my experience, beginner players or even intermediate players don't play so well from the white side against the Alekhine. They just don't seem to know as much theory as against more popular defenses such as the Sicilian Defense. Now, let's move on to the next opening. Okay, so here we are with the so-called Scandinavian Defense. And to me, this is a sister defense to the Alekhine, for the purposes of this video at least, because in the Alekhine defense, we saw black's knight steps out and moves around a lot, and white ends up with more space. Let's check out what happens in the main line of the Scandinavian. So the queen steps out in this case, wasting a bunch of time, and white ends up with more space. So it's the same 2 things, only in the Scandinavian defense, you're moving your queen around a bunch, and in the Alekhine, it's your knight. Now, in my view, these 2 problems lead to a position that is quite comfortable for white. For example, if they know the theory, here is how the theory of the main line goes. So c6, just creating some wiggle room for the queen. Bishop goes to c4, bishop f5, looking to develop that bishop before eventually, moving this pawn and making sure that the bishop is not caught behind the pawns. So white goes bishop to d2, eyeing up the queen, and now black continues their development. And here, a funky looking move is the main theoretical line, and that is this move knight to d5. You cannot take the knight because of the queen being attacked. So the queen has to drop back, and now we see the idea that white has with this move is to capture this knight. And black faces a difficult choice. Do you either capture with the pawn, and then all of a sudden, are you going to castle king side? Are you going to castle queen side? That's not looking great either with this pawn move to c6. So if you capture with the pawn, you are going to have king problems, and some endgames are not going to be very good. And yet, capturing with the pawn is the most popular move. And the reason for this is that if you capture with the queen, well, you first went here, then you went here, then you went here, then you're going here. White does have some bishop to g5 ideas, so it's very easy to land yourself into serious trouble by moving the queen around quite as much as this. So the Scandinavian is not an opening that I would recommend until you're at least at the intermediate level. So this brings us on to the next opening, which is in fact not just one opening, but a whole group of openings. And that is after the move c5, marking the beginning of the Sicilian defense. Now, there's a lot of Sicilians that you can play, from Najdorf to Sveshnikov to Poulsen to Dragon, many Sicilians, and most of them are really good, and they've been seen right up to the top level. So that makes it, the fact that they're so good does make it a little bit easier to play, right? Because you're playing a quality system. However, the reason why I'm putting it here as an opening that is probably best suited for at least early intermediate level is the fact that the theory gets really, really complicated. And for that, let's check out the most popular Sicilian, the so-called Sicilian Najdorf. So after knight f3, d6, d4, we capture here, knight takes. Already you have some imbalance, but that's not super crazy to understand, right? So the imbalance, the difference in the position is black has this semi-open c file, white has the semi-open d file. That does create some strategic complexity, but it's nothing crazy so far. Now, the next level of complexity comes here after the move, not after the move a6, but rather after the move e5, where black accepts what's called a backward pawn, meaning the pawn cannot easily advance because of the control of the d5 square and the fact that neither black's e-pawn nor black's c-pawn exist far enough behind to support a d5 push. So this backward pawn does potentially lead to some trouble for black. But anyway, white goes knight to b3, bishop e6, f3. White sets up what's known as the English attack, where white will target our king side with moving these pawns, and then white will also set up with queen d2 and queenside castle. And we're going to see this in a second. Here, castle and queenside castle, and now knight d7 and g4. So we see that white sets up here with the English attack. The problem that we have is that the theory can get completely insane here. So black here plays the move b5, white goes g5, and now if you're not sure what you're doing, well, you're gonna think either I go here or here. Not true. You go b4. And then white's knight is under fire, so white goes knight to e2, and now you should go to e8. To me, maybe knight h5 makes the most intuitive sense, but no, theory says you have to go to e8. Now, after knight e8, white plays f4, looking for f5 ideas. So you can see that one of the things that makes the Sicilian difficult to play is that your opponents are going after your throat straight away. So after f4, black goes a5, and after f5, black goes a4. So the bishop is now hanging, and white can take here, but black can take here, white can take here, but black can take here. So the theory gets really crazy. What does white play here normally? Well, they go knight d4. That's a difficult move to understand, but the point is that after pawn takes, knight takes, the bishop is still hanging, and white is banking on recovering their bishop. Now you might be thinking, well, I can't go here, that's true. I can't go here, but I can just capture this pawn. And here is white's second idea that's very important. Knight to c6, the bishop is hit, and the queen is also hit. If the queen moves, the bishop falls, and it'll fall with check. So you can see that this is just one line in the Sicilian Najdorf, but you can see that unless you know a lot of theory, you're at a huge disadvantage. And the reason is because, first of all, there's huge amounts of theory, but the stakes are really high. So the play is so concrete and so sharp that if you don't know the theory and your opponent does, you could end up down a piece or getting checkmated really, really quickly. That doesn't happen in other openings, and that is what I think makes the Sicilian defense best suited for intermediate players and beyond. Now, the next two openings are pretty similar in difficulty. They're the Caro-Kann Defense and the French Defense. In my view, the Caro-Kann is probably very, very slightly more difficult to play. In order to understand that, let's first talk about the French Defense, which I think is a little bit easier to play. So in the French Defense, you play e6, and after d4, your idea is to go d5. What I think makes the French a little bit easier to play is that very often, let's say white plays the advanced variation, very often you're going to be dealing with this particular pawn structure, pawns on e6, d5, and c5. And you can actually wind up with pretty systematic play where black's idea is to put a lot of pressure on this pawn on d4. And although the French defense does have some problems, namely the fact that this bishop, the so-called French bishop, is not a good piece because it's trapped behind its own light squared pawns here in the center, nevertheless, you as a French defense player can actually learn the typical strategies to solve this problem, right? So it's very easy as a French defense player to get used to how do you play against the white center. So you put a lot of pressure on it with this. Sometimes maybe you move the knight over to f5 to put more pressure on d4. Other times you play f6 and you can see that pressure. And when it comes to solving the problem of this light squared bishop, well, sometimes you're going to go, you're going to move this pawn and you're going to go to a6 and swap it for the f1 bishop. Sometimes you're going to move it via d7 and b5, and other times you're even going to do something like this. I will show you. So you get a position like this, and let's just imagine it. And what you will actually do is you will move the bishop this way. So you'll actually kind of move like a snake and bring it either to g6 or to h5. So the reason why I think that the French defense is a little bit easier than the Caro-Kann is because these ideas tend to repeat more often. Now, if we move on to the Caro-Kann instead, then after c6 here, white goes d4 and black goes d5. I think that it's, you know, this is, the Caro-Kann for me is like a late beginner, early intermediate level, or maybe early intermediate, while French is still late beginner. And so the reason why I think it's not as difficult to play as other openings is because of the fact that black's idea is to immediately challenge white's center. And one of the things that the Caro-Kann does have going for it that the French doesn't is that you keep this diagonal for your bishop open. So as a result, you're not going to have to deal with having a bad piece quite as often as in the French defense. However, I do think that the Caro-Kann has more options for the opponent, right? So in this position, white can play the so-called fantasy variation. They can play the exchange variation. They can play from this position, they can go c3 and play it slow, or they can change the structure and eventually get a position that leaves white with an isolated queen's pawn. So in the Caro-Kann, in my experience, and the Caro-Kann is my favorite opening, so it's my main weapon. In my experience, the Caro-Kann has a lot of different pawn structures and different plans that white can go for. Whereas in the French defense, you seem to be calling the shots a little bit more than white. So I think that makes it a little bit more tricky. Now, another thing that should be mentioned in the Caro-Kann is that whereas in the French defense, you go e6 and then you very quickly undermine the center, in the Caro-Kann, that's not so much the case because you went c6. So if white, let's say, plays e5 and grabs some space, what happens in the Caro-Kann is that you end up with a position like this, and eventually you say, I need to challenge this center, so you go c5. But because you spent one move first on c6 and a second on c5, you get sort of one benefit of the Caro-Kann versus the French, which is you get this bishop developed, but you get a disadvantage, which is that you spent more time moving the c-pawn. As a result, white can have what's called an initiative. White can actually use that development advantage to put you under pressure before you've completed your development. So, for example, white goes bishop e3, pawn takes, knight takes, and as a Caro-Kann player, you might be tempted, you know, my bishop is under fire, I don't want to let them capture it, so I'm going to go bishop to g6. But after you play something like castle, maybe you go knight to c6, very natural play, suddenly white goes c4, and before you know it, you're in a lot of trouble because white's king is still castled and you just have been too slow because unlike in the French defense, you've been very worried about making sure this bishop's a good piece. And yeah, you know, it is a good piece now, but the rest of your pieces are in trouble. So this is something that you need to be careful of. And it takes a little bit more knowledge of the game to understand that, for example, in this position, the move you need to play is knight e7. And you need to be ready to part with the bishop pair. So I think slightly harder questions to resolve, but on the other hand, and I am biased, on the other hand, the beauty of the Caro-Kann is it exposes you to more rich ideas, lots of different pawn structures, lots of different imbalances or differences in the position. And at the same time, I don't think any of them are so difficult to understand. I think that they're pretty intuitive ideas in the Caro-Kann for the most part. So that's the Caro-Kann and the French defense. Let's move on. So by now we've covered the modern defense, we've covered the Pirc defense, we've looked at the Scandinavian, the Alekhine defense, the Sicilian, and we've looked at the French defense and the Caro-Kann in that order. And at this point, well, there's not that much left. In fact, there's only one major opening system left, and that's the one that I think is best suited for beginner level players, but also it's just excellent choice across all levels. As high as the absolute elite, it remains and will remain one of the most popular defenses against e4, and that is, of course, the move pawn to e5. Now, why I think that this is a great choice for beginners is because of the symmetry. So in the early stages of the game, you do the same as your opponent, and as a result of this, you don't fall too far behind in terms of space and central control. And that's useful because I think it's just harder to play when you have less space than your opponent and your opponent controls the center. Now, in addition to this, I think that there's another reason why it's very good to play in this way, which is that all of the ideas are, in my view, pretty intuitive, pretty clear to understand. For example, after white goes knight f3, we defend the pawn. And now here white has two major paths. One is bishop to c4, and this is the so-called Italian game, and it will teach you about how to manage the attack on what is the, classically speaking, that's the most vulnerable, and it will teach you how to manage the attack against the most vulnerable point in black's position. And in fact, we can say the same about white's position. That is a pawn that only has one defender, and that defender is the king. So you learn about something that is extremely important right off the bat. Here, for example, you get a fork in the road. You can learn positions that revolve around copying your opponent for now, this symmetrical position, which is the Italian game. And here, there's some really fascinating lines to consider. So this kind of slow Italian game is what you will see grandmasters doing most of the time. But sometimes beginner players or amateur players, they'll go c3 and then they'll go d4. Of course, even grandmasters play like this. But after this move d4, we will learn, for example, about how to combat the center, but we do it in way less extreme version. We do a way less extreme version of it than in other openings that we saw, like the modern defense or the Pirc, because here we have ideas like bishop to b4 check. And when white blocks, whether it's with bishop d2 or knight to c3, we can actually win this pawn on e4. So we get to play these interesting positions where, yes, white is grabbing a bit of an initiative, but hey, we have a pawn for it. So that's, I think, a good training ground to understand these kind of positions where black is by no means worse. If anything, I think black has the slightly better position in a lot of these lines. So that's one of the reasons I think it's a good way to approach it. And we said that against the Italian game, we don't only have to play the move bishop to c5, but instead we can play the move knight f6. And here you get, again, a situation where white can just play d3 and defend the pawn, but sometimes white can play knight g5 and continue the attack against that f7 pawn. Now after d5, to block that attack, pawn takes, most beginner players will capture here knight takes d5. And again, I think this is great that you go through this situation, and eventually you will face a lot of opponents who will capture you here on f7. And over time, you'll realize, wait, I'm up a piece, but it turns out that after this check, this is the so-called Fagatello or fried liver attack. It turns out that after this check, you're actually in a little bit of trouble here because you have to go king e6 and defend your knight. So you might be able to win some games from this position as black, but over time you will learn about things like the value of king safety and how somehow, even though you're up a piece for just a pawn, somehow white can actually have the better position. So you get exposed to these tactical ideas very early on, and I think that helps a lot your development as a chess player. Now, as you mature as a chess player, you'll want to be sort of uncovering ideas, strategic ideas and tactical ideas that are more advanced and more complex. And to show an example of how much complexity there is, how much strategic richness, we can actually go back to this position and take a look at the so-called Ruy Lopez with bishop to b5. Now, the Ruy Lopez, or the Spanish, has a very simple concept, which is let me put pressure on this knight, and in so doing, I may be able to cause problems to the pawn on e5. Now, after bishop b5, we are normally going to be kicking back that bishop. The bishop goes to a4. Again, something that's strategically very interesting is if white captures. Then you get this battle where you have doubled pawns, but in exchange you also have the bishop pair, and you get to discover that the bishop pair fully compensates for the slightly worse pawn structure. When white, on the other hand, goes bishop to a4, you go knight f6 and you target this pawn. And after castle, one of the things I like about playing in this way is that usually at every major juncture, black can actually choose which direction they want to go in. So for example, here you can play the so-called open variation, or you can play the closed variation. And that choice that black has makes it a little bit easier than if it's your opponent that has a choice, right? If your opponent can play 6 moves and they're all kind of good, and you have to be prepared against all of them, and this happens in openings like in the Sicilian Defense, well, that makes it harder for you to prepare your theory. Whereas if it's your choice whether you want to become an expert in the open variation or an expert in the closed, then that makes the study of the openings a little bit more manageable. So after bishop to e7, white here goes rook e1, and now the idea is, with the pawn defended, white's intention is to now capture and take the pawn. So what does black do? They go b5 to prevent that threat. Bishop goes to b3. And again, one of the things that I think makes the e4, e5 positions really interesting is you can also, not only can you choose which branch of the road or which fork in the road you go down, but you can also choose which opening to play based on your style, right? So for example, here, let's say you're an aggressive player. Well, you can castle, and when white goes c3, you can play the move pawn to d5. And this is the so-called Marshall Gambit, where after pawn takes, knight takes, knight takes, knight takes, rook takes, and c6, you're down a pawn, but hey, you know, that bishop is coming to d6, queen goes to h4, maybe bishop to g4, and you can see that you're going to have a lot of attacking possibilities. On the other hand, if you're not that kind of player and you don't want to gambit, in this position, you can simply play pawn to d6 instead. Now, after pawn d6, white goes c3, castle, and white goes h3, and you have a much more quiet game. And finally, in this position, you have again a choice, a wide choice, and I think one of the things that will help you to understand and develop your knowledge of the game very well is that you have to, at some point, in the beginning, you're going to make a choice. Which opening system do I play from here? Do I go, for example, for the floor system with bishop to b7? Do I go for the Chigorin with knight a5? Do I go for the Breyer with knight to b8? But over time, you might mess around with one opening system and you'll realize, man, you know, the problem that this system has is I wind up, let's say, in the Chigorin with knight a5, bishop going to c2 and going c5. First, you learn that you're controlling the center and the value of that idea. But then you might realize that sometimes in the Chigorin, this knight winds up on b7 and it turns out to be a really bad piece. And you might say, okay, I don't want that. So you might instead move on and eventually explore, let's say, the Breyer, which is Magnus Carlsen, a favorite of Magnus Carlsen. And there you learn, it actually makes quite a lot of sense for me to spend 2 moves in the middle game in order to just reroute the knight to a better square. So I think there's this beautiful strategic complexity that is able to sort of take you all the way to grandmaster level knowledge if you study it deeply enough, but at the same time it's accessible to beginner level players. So accessible tactics, accessible strategy, and as much of it as you want, right? As difficult and as complex as you want, the e4, e5 positions will offer that to you. So that's it as far as this video has gone. It's been a pretty long video as we've covered all of the major opening systems, but I hope that even if the video has been a little bit of a long one, I hope that it will save you time when it comes to deciding which opening is best for you against 1e4. If you've enjoyed this video, drop a like, helps out the channel. And also, if there is some video suggestions that you have, if you like this idea, I'll probably do the same one for 1d4 openings and then do something as well to help out our decisions as white players. So keep an eye out for those, and I will see you very soon.